Oh, fantastic.
Hey, Leanne.
But
Hi,
hey, everybody. Hello. People are still coming in, but I think I'm going to get us going anyway. Just want to say welcome, everyone, and thank you so much for coming. My name is Greg Findley. I'm one of the course directors for our flagship course at Terra.do called Climate Change Learning for Action. I want to say hello to all of our fellows from all over the world and the alumni from Learning for Action. And welcome to any members of the public that may be joining us from outside the Terra.do community. We do hope if you're from outside that you'll check us out by going to our website, Terra.do. Now is a great time to apply for our next cohort of Learning for Action, which launches in October. This event you've joined today is part of a slate of guest talks for the Learning for Action course, and hopefully it will give you a taste of what you can expect if you do sign up for the program. Without further ado, an especially warm welcome to our guest speaker for today, Dr. Elizabeth Sawin. I've been a big fan of Dr. Sawin's for a long time and share her Twitter posts and other threads with groups here at Terra.do all the time. Beth Sawin is founder and director of the Multisolving Institute, and she's an expert on solutions that address climate change while also improving health, well-being, equity, and economic vitality. She developed the idea of multi-solving to help people see and create conditions for such win-win-win solutions. Beth writes and speaks about multi-solving, climate change, and leadership based on systems thinking to local, national, and international audiences. Her work has been published in Nonprofit Quarterly, the Stanford Social Innovation Review, US News, the Daily Climate, System Dynamics Review, and more. And her work has been covered in Time, Forbes, the Washington Post, and other magazines and papers. In 2010, Beth co-founded Climate Interactive, which she co-directed until 2021. While at Climate Interactive, by the way, for those of you in our course and our alumni, Climate Interactive are the ones behind En-ROADS. While she was at Climate Interactive, she led the scientific team that offered the first assessment of the sufficiency of country pledges to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. And she was a contributing author of the first UNEP emissions gap report. Beth also led Climate Interactive's efforts to integrate measures of equity, health, and well-being into decision support tools and computer simulations. She has trained and mentored global sustainability leaders in the Donella Meadows Fellows Program and provided systems thinking training to both Ashoka and Dalai Lama Fellows. Since 2014, Beth has participated in the Council on the Uncertain Human Future, a continuing dialogue on issues of climate change and sustainability among a select group of humanities scholars, writers, artists, and climate scientists. She's also a member of the advisory board to the Kresge Foundation's Climate Change Health and Equity Program. She's a biologist with a PhD from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and she trained in systems dynamics and sustainability with Donella Meadows and worked at Sustainability Institute, the research institute founded by Meadows, for 13 years. Beth has 2 adult daughters and lives in rural Vermont, where she and her husband grow as much of their own food as they can manage. We're really excited to have Beth here today, but before I pass it over to Beth, just a couple of points of housekeeping. As usual, please keep your microphone muted for the duration of the talk. I will be facilitating the question and answers along with Hannah, another course director, which is reserved for the current fellows in the Learning for Action course. If we do run out of questions there and have extra time, we will open it up to the public to ask questions in the chat. So for the time being, please refrain from posting questions in the chat, and we'll let you know if we're going to turn to the chat for questions. If you're a fellow in the course, you can find the link to the Slido in my post earlier today, and Hannah is going to share that link with you in the chat here. So with that, over to you, Beth, and thanks for being here.
Oh, thanks so much for that. Welcome, Greg. Hi, everybody. You heard a whole bunch of fellows programs in my bio. I find it one of the biggest honors of my career, actually, the work of working with people who are building their leadership for climate and sustainability. So I'm glad to dip into your community a little bit today. I'm going to share my screen. Give me a minute to get to the right place. Yeah, so today we are going to talk about multi-solving, and what I mean by that word will become clear in just a couple minutes. I love the fact that we're together from all around the world, thanks to Zoom, but I also kind of hate it. I kind of hate staring at this little green dot and you're all very flat looking in your boxes there. So I'm going to rely a little bit on this tool I bet some of you know called Poll Everywhere. So we can be a little bit interactive. And I think Hannah's going to put the link in the chat for you. So if you go there now and then throughout the next 30 minutes, I'll have a few questions or things for you to weigh in on. And here's the first one, which is really just, why are you here? Why are we here? What do you protect? What needs protecting? And once you get to that link, if you start answering that question, we'll be able to kind of crowdsource today what it is that people are protecting. So I have to do one more step to actually allow you to have your input. Recording. I do. All right. So hopefully now some of you will get there and you can start answering that question. What are you protecting? Daughter's future, kids' future, hope, clean air, humanity, biodiversity, the whole planet, beauty, populations of people, beautiful dreams, possibilities, animals, nature, species. And just let this keep building for just a minute. And I'm going to tell you while this is building the punchline of what I want to share today. In fact, if you just listen to this and then depending on your time zone, you go take a nap or something, you'll have got the most important thing. And that's this. Around the world, people are becoming part of a movement that's figuring out how to bundle these things that need protecting together in ways where they can be protected at once with a single action, a single investment. And so when resources are scarce, when time is so pressing, as we know, that process of bundling problems together and therefore bundling our efforts together, that's what I call multi-solving. And I think it's, for me, one of the most hope-producing things I know about in this time. So I hope to share a little bit of that with you today. So here's a picture of a case study that we looked into at the Multisolving Institute. And it's a project called Living Streets in the UK. The organization at the center of it is called Living Streets. And it's a climate protection program. It created safe routes for school children to walk to school, and therefore reduced, I think it was trips by car by 25% at that pickup and drop off time of the day. This next slide is a picture of a health intervention program. It's called Living Streets. It's in the UK. It was a response to the fact that over time, more and more children weren't getting the recommended daily amount of physical activity, and that was declared a health crisis. And so this was a project to make it easier for kids to have a safe way to walk to school and get more physical activity. This is a picture of an air pollution reduction program. Because more kids were walking to school, there were less cars around, there was less air pollution producing asthma and other respiratory illnesses that are particularly damaging to kids and their growing lungs. This is actually a family expense reduction program. Every family that didn't have to maintain a vehicle to get kids to and from school and pay for gasoline to do so saved a little bit of money with each car trip. This is a picture of a congestion improvement program. There were huge traffic jams around schools at those moments when kids were being picked up and dropped off. So Zoom's working, right? I'm not actually changing slides. And that's because this one project did all of those things. And different partners involved in it entered the project based on their caring about particular issues, but they found ways to address all those issues together. So when I talk about bundling those things that we need to protect, this is an example of that. Here's one more. This is a picture of a jobs program. This is a project called Warm Up New Zealand. It was a response to the 2008-2009 financial crisis. And it was aimed at retrofitting housing to be more energy efficient. But the main impetus for it was to get the construction sector back to work in the financial crisis. This is also a picture of a health intervention. Scientists started studying the health of the people who lived in these buildings that had been upgraded, and they found that there were fewer hospitalizations and reduced medication costs. That's just from people living in homes that became tighter, right? That were warmer, that were less drafty. So this was a health program. And in fact, what started as an energy efficiency program on the strength of those results started having public health investment as well. And it grew to the point where doctors could refer patients for home energy improvements. So I like to say, instead of take an aspirin and call me in the morning, it was like, get new windows, get insulation in the attic. This is also an economic equity program because the heating and utility bills of people living in these homes went down, and many of them were people living on a fixed income. And so they had more of their income available for things like food, medicine, education, recreation. So I'm hoping you're starting to see the theme that we can protect things that matter, many of them at once, if we're careful about how we go about it, if we're strategic. And that is what we use the word multi-solving to refer to, using one investment of time or effort to solve several problems at once in a way that also improves equity. Some of the, I guess I would just now turn to say that multi-solving covers all kinds of benefits, all kinds of things that need protecting. And here is a little tool that we use at the Multisolving Institute to remind us of some of the most important co-benefits. One of them is jobs and livelihoods, like those people making those homes more energy efficient. One is resilience, helping communities prepare for shocks of all sorts, climate shocks, but others like supply chain disruptions or pandemics. Energy and mobility, just helping people have access to energy and move around their world. Food and water, protecting clean water, providing access to healthy food. Climate protection, reducing greenhouse gas emissions or sequestering carbon. Biodiversity, protecting ecosystems and habitats and species and the communities of people that are connected with them. Health and well-being, like the Walk to School program or that energy efficiency program, improving people's health and their access to all the factors that are needed for well-being. And at the center is the co-benefit that actually is also required to get all of the other benefits, and that's connection. That's people working together, being more connected to one another, being more connected to nature. In many cases, that's the intervention that allows all of these other co-benefits to happen. Multi-solving, we think of it as a movement around the world. I mentioned that. And it takes many different forms. It's hard for people to recognize it as a movement, actually, because it looks so diverse in its different places. So I'm going to share with you some of my favorite. I call them multi-solving champions. Here's one example: trees and green space. Think about it. Trees help fight the urban heat island effect. They clean the air and water. They help with urban stormwater flooding, which is becoming more and more a problem around the world with more erratic rainfall patterns. They improve people's sense of health and well-being. The work of planting and taking care of trees and green space can be a source of good jobs that can't be outsourced. Walking and cycling is a fantastic multi-solving solution. It provides equitable mobility and is open to, for instance, people who may not be able to afford a car or have a driver's license. And especially if it's done with attention to disabilities, it can open up access really to broad ranges of people and communities. It's also a health intervention. Study after study shows how many chronic diseases go down in their incidence if it's easier for people to safely get where they need to go, their short trips via walking and cycling. recycling. And of course, it's reduces emissions, greenhouse gas emissions from the transportation sector. It's also an economic boon for communities. Again, study after study showing how the commercial activity at shops in neighborhoods that have a lot of walking and cycling goes up. It's people aren't zooming by in their cars, but they're able to interact with small shopkeepers along the way. Public transportation obviously is another way to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from the transportation sector. It's another way to have mobility accessible to many people, and studies that focus on what are the factors that help people overcome poverty. Actually, access to mobility is one of the most important things to get to school, to get to work, to get to access to healthcare. So public transportation, particularly if it's developed with an eye toward equity, is an important multi-solving champion. Renewable energy, of course, produces energy, reduces greenhouse gases to the extent that it replaces carbon-intensive energy sources like coal, oil, and gas. It can also be a health and air pollution. It can be a health intervention in the sense that displacing those fossil fuels improves air quality, which improves all of the health issues that come along with the way that fossil fuels pollute our air and impact our health. Energy efficiency, and that's the Warm Up New Zealand example that we started with. It is a way to save money for the people who live in homes, reduce greenhouse gas emissions from the built environment, improve the health of people who live in buildings, and reduce what's called the energy burden, the percent of someone's paycheck that they spend on heating and cooling and utility bills, which of course hits people from low-income communities the hardest. The largest percentage of someone's paycheck on energy bills it happens for people in the sort of lowest socioeconomic levels. It hits the hardest. So energy efficiency can be an economic equity opportunity at the same time. So I want to stop with those champions and go to our poll again. And now I want you to think about the work that you're doing or thinking about doing within Terra.do, or if you're not in that program, just like something you do in your job or in your activism or something you invest in. So here you should see, if you go back to poll everywhere, you should be able to click on this image, and you should be able to click a bunch of times. So where's your focus? Like, which of these multi-solving champions are you involved in? And if you're doing something that you think is multi-solving and it's not one of these boxes, click in the white space and we'll celebrate that too. So look at those dots landing across all these multi-solving champions. And that's kind of what I mean about multi-solving being a global movement. And many times we have the experience of people saying, yeah, that's exactly what I do. I didn't know really that there was a word for it. And I didn't necessarily see the connections to these other types of multi-solving. What we focus on at the Multisolving Institute is telling the specifics of these stories, but also looking across them to what's in common, because it's a way of working as much as a particular kind of work. So thanks, and I'm glad to see some love for all of my favorite multi-solving champions. They're all getting lots of little teardrops there. Here's another way that I like to think about multi-solving, from US President Dwight Eisenhower, who I didn't necessarily know was a multi-solver, but here's what he said. He said, whenever I run into a problem I can't solve, I always make it bigger. I can never solve it by trying to make it smaller, but if I can make it big enough, I can begin to see the outlines of a solution. And that is, I think, what makes multi-solving, at least in kind of our US culture, not sure if this is true around the world, but makes it kind of countercultural. For so many things we're taught in our education system, for instance, like if something's hard, break it into smaller pieces. Multi-solving actually says that's not always the case. Sometimes things get easier when you figure out how to bundle them together, because solutions that might not be cost effective or that you might not have enough votes for or people to help with actually get easier when you begin to see how they fit together. So I bet that you're already thinking about examples of multi-solving in your work. If I'm doing my job, you're starting to see that. So I want to go back to Pull Everywhere. And this time, I'd like you to say, like, what's something you're working on and what are some of the problems that are bundled together? And you'll be able to type in just a few words for that. So here, just to model kind of how I think this will work, you might say, I'm working on helping plant an urban orchard. And the problems that I'm bundling together are lack of food access in my neighborhood, heat risk from lack of tree cover, and lack of job opportunities because we have a job training program as part of that. So that kind of level, like a short sentence. Let's go back to Pull Everywhere and make it so you all can answer that. So examples of multi-solving, and tell us what problems are being bundled together. Hopefully you all are typing and it's working. Air pollution, gendered use of time, and energy efficiency. Clean energy, climate change, air pollution, lower energy costs, jobs, parks, and accessibility. Problem solving, critical thinking, gender divide in STEM, reduction of emissions, increase of energy efficiency, attracting talent, electric car and scooter for transportation. Energy gardens, I love that phrase. Clean air, green space, community creation. Retrofitting homes, biodiversity, jobs, soil generation. Yeah, there's a lot of work to be done in creating the world that we need. Supply chains, food security, health, sustainable growth, watershed restoration. These are great. And y'all see what I mean about hopefulness when you notice around the world the level of multi-solving that people are stepping up to. Household savings, more resilience, more confidence. Carbon drawdown, green jobs, carbon removal, upcycling, employment, water for agriculture, better economic times, biodiversity, supply chain. That's great. I know we could probably go on and on, but I'm going to keep us moving because we want to have time for questions at the end of these slides. I don't know if I need to tell you all 4 reasons to multi-solve because clearly you're already doing it, but maybe these will help you explain why you're doing what you do to your stakeholders. The first, we lost the slide here. The first reason to multi-solve is to advance equity and justice. You know, that challenge will look different depending on what part of the world we're in, but I think it's fair to say there's probably nowhere on earth that doesn't have an equity crisis of one level or another: gender equity, racial equity, economic equity, and so on. And here in the US, I wanted to share something in the news. This is analysis from a group out of Princeton at the brand new climate legislation in the US, just signed yesterday by President Biden. And this research group at Princeton looked at how much clean energy or new energy is going to be added over time. So this is the past, right? This is annual investment in energy. And here's where the new Inflation Reduction Act kicks in. Do you see this just step change in how much is going to get built as a result of this one piece of legislation? So think about gender equity. We know in the old energy system, there's not gender equity. If you look at jobs and opportunities in the United States energy sector as it stands, women aren't equitably represented. There's not racial equity. If we have to rebuild our energy system to address climate change, the opportunity to do that in a way that creates a more just economy, I think is really unprecedented. So that's one of the first reasons to multi-solve. Another reason is just to win, right? We're up against vested interests that don't want our world to change to address climate change. And here's a graph I saw years ago that really drove this home for me. This is the life cycle costs of coal in the United States for a year divided into a pie chart. And this dark blue region, that's the cost of the climate impacts from building coal. That's the fires and floods and storms. Everything else is basically a health impact. It's air pollution and what all the ways in which air pollution affects respiratory illness, cardiovascular illness, premature birth, dementia, all of those are linked to air pollution. And then there's the health of people in the places where coal is extracted. So when I started in the climate movement years and years ago, we were focused only on this one piece of the pie, right? Less than a quarter of the impacts of coal. And we thought other people were working on public health and economic development in Appalachia. We didn't see ourselves as invested in a common struggle. And you can bet the fossil fuel industry was really glad that we were so divided, that we didn't understand how all of our issues were connected, because that's a lot less people in each of these wedges of pie than we would be together. It's a lot less philanthropy. It's a lot less voters. So another reason to multisolve is just to make progress. Another reason is to try to actually unite timescales. There's today and there's the future, and it's really sad when those feel like they're in tension with each other. Multisolving helps relieve some of that tension, and here's what I mean. When we break free of fossil fuels today, we improve well-being this decade, right? Air pollution gets better really fast after you stop burning coal, oil, and gas. Those particles come out of the air, and the air is cleaner almost right away, whereas the CO2 that we've prevented from entering the atmosphere, that's really going to affect the global climate later in the century over decades. So we're taking actions together that help people today and protect people and places in the future. And that's another reason to multisolve. The last reason of these 4 reasons is just like fiscal prudence, to be careful with dollars. If you can spend the same dollar or the same hour and solve 2 problems, 4 problems, 6 problems at the same time, like who wouldn't want to do that? And so that's one of the most important reasons to multisolve, especially as we face all these crises that we know are getting bigger and bigger, faster and faster. We have to make everything count. I was talking not long ago to a funder who focuses on conservation and who is trying to also make sure their conservation investments address climate change and equity. And one of the things he said is, with inflation, every dollar we have to invest in conservation, like we have less dollars, less impact. We can get fewer acres for the resources that we have, but we're trying to do that in a way where we get multiple benefits. So multisolving is really exciting. Multisolving has these important reasons for doing it. It seems really intuitive. Yet I want to also tell you kind of the bad news side. At least right now, there's a huge gap between what's possible and what's actually happening. I'm going to give 2 quick examples of that. We're going to get a little more into the numbers than we've been so far. The first one is an example from the last few years of governments around the world spending an economic recovery from COVID-19. The very beginning of the pandemic, a group of scientists said, there's an opportunity coming up. We know there's going to be this economic investment. Let's steer it toward clean energy. And they said it would only take $1.4 trillion a year to be on track toward Paris goals. And Hannah, I think you have some links for these studies if people want to dig into that. So that was the possibility. Here's what happened. Last time I checked, more than $17 trillion around the world was spent in COVID economic recovery. This bar here, this is the 1.4 those scientists said was needed. Here's what actually happened. I forget, I think it's like 280 billion, something like that. So that's a huge missed opportunity, right? All this money flowing through, wouldn't have been that much of it, and we didn't even muster that. Here's another example. The public health benefits resulting from ambitious mitigation efforts, i.e. meeting the Paris Agreement goals, would far outweigh their costs. That was the World Health Organization in 2021 saying, yes, we have to spend money to address climate change, but the good news is we're going to get more money back from the health benefits. And that's mostly because of how bad air pollution from fossil fuels is for our health. So that's the possibility the World Health Organization sees. And then they went and measured countries' climate plans, and they looked at what % of countries are including excuse me, including health considerations in their climate plans. And I thought it would be fun for you guys to guess what you think that number is. So you should be able to vote. Is it 10% of countries are multi-solving for climate and health, 75%, somewhere in between? We'll just let this bounce around for a minute. Y'all are not too optimistic about countries. Nobody thinks it's 75%. Oh, prove me wrong. Okay, but you guys are mostly right. Your hunch is in the right area. The World Health Organization said that about 1 in 5, so 20% of countries analyze health co-benefits in their national climate policies. So that's discouraging and also encouraging. There's huge room for improvement. It's probably not surprising that there's a multi-solving gap because there's a lot of obstacles to multi-solving in how we've structured our world. And I'm gonna talk about a few of them that people encounter on the journey from working in silos to working together in a collective cooperative way to multi-solve. First, they have to cross the mountains of disciplinarity, right? You know, I'm trained in medicine and you're trained in climate, and we speak different languages, we go to different conferences, we work in different buildings. Then there's the swamp of budgetary silos. Most of the time, these decisions are made by, say, a transportation department and a health department. And those are not a united process, even though there's some investments that would advance both. There's some investments where the cost might be in the transportation department and the benefit might be in the health department. That's really hard to make happen if the decisions about spending are being made in isolation. Then there's the jurisdictional river, right? There's both like, oh, well, that's a county decision and that's a state decision. And also that's a public works department decision and that's a public health department decision. To effectively multi-solve, people have to get over those mountains, through that swamp, across this river. Then there's the forest of inequity, right? We were talking about in current systems, how there's so much inequity baked in. To truly multi-solve, people need to be able to grapple with that. But a lot of us don't feel equipped for it. We don't feel like we know how to get into those difficult conversations. We don't know how to move money in different ways. We don't know how to invite different decision makers to the table. People need support to navigate the historical inequities so they don't reproduce them in the future. And then there's just the desert of unfamiliarity. People aren't used to working in this way. It's really common actually in multi-solving projects where people are sort of like, but what are we actually doing here? Because it looks like they're doing a lot of talking, planning, building shared understanding and shared vision before they get to the part that looks more familiar, like building a new bike lane. We should have some compassion for leaders and for ourselves that there is this multi-solving gap because there are these reasons for it. And that's part of the purpose of the Multisolving Institute, is to try to provide tools and support to help it just be a little easier to get through these obstacles. So we want to get to questions from you all. So I'm going to end on this last point, because I know that so many of you are practitioners, that you're doing this program because you are committed to working on climate change. I wanted to offer you 3 questions that I think you could take with you to add more multi-solving to your work. And it feels like many of you already are, but maybe this will help you even take it up a few notches. So here's the first one. We notice that multi-solvers start by asking, how might solving my problem help someone else solve theirs? So it starts with acknowledging, what's keeping me up at night. Maybe that's the long-term climate future. But are there steps towards improving the long-term climate future that could help somebody's kindergartner who's in the emergency room with an asthma attack, right? Are there steps towards solving climate change, the long-term climate future, that could help protect an endangered species that somebody else is really worried about? So how might solving my problem help someone else solve theirs? And I mean that in the deepest, sincerest way. We see in the US and probably elsewhere, sometimes kind of transactional alliances, like, yeah, to get this vote through, we need such and such constituency. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about devoting yourself to someone else's problem as well as the one that you're motivated on. The second question is, what would need to be true for the benefits of this work to be equitably shared? So we looked at that image of the 8 different co-benefits. Those don't necessarily flow equitably if you don't take deliberate action. In fact, they probably don't, because we're doing this work in existing systems that are inequitable. So you need to start by asking what has to be true for the benefits to be equitably shared. And that might lead you to who else needs to be involved, or what else do we have to fundraise for? Like, this will have implications that will potentially make your work more taxing, but also make your work a lot more transformational. And then the last question is, who else needs to be involved? And what do I need to do to help them feel welcome? Another way you could phrase that is, who do I have to be as a leader to create work that is welcoming for everybody who would need to be involved if this were to be truly multi-solving? So I hope those questions are useful. I know they're not easy and they're not going to have pat answers. And you can ask them again and again. The thing about multi-solving is it's not you do it once and you're done. It's a way of approaching your work. So you could ask these 3 questions before every meeting, before every grant proposal, before every retrospective of what you've accomplished. So I want to end kind of as we started, with one of those word clouds that we'll generate together. But this time, I'd like you to think about, what would you love? What would you love about a world with more multi-solving in it? What do you think that world would be like? What would you love about a world with more multi-solving? It would be holistic, I agree. Happy, harmonious, diversity, relationships cooperative. It would be beautiful. I think so too. There'd be balance, there'd be inclusion and connection, progress and synergy. Beautiful. And one thing I would offer, because I know the work that you all are doing is hard sometimes, but everything that you're putting up here on this word cloud, comes into focus in moments. It's not like a destination where we're someday going to get there and then we'll be like, yeah, we're finally connected, we have empathy and it's inclusive and we're collaborative, right? It's like, it can be more like, in getting that park built, that was inclusive, right? In that one meeting, when you stopped to listen to what that quiet voice on the other side of the room had to say, we were flourishing together. So I invite you to think about multi-solving in this ongoing way that we can all always get better at, and that we can create moment to moment to moment. So I am going to stop sharing my screen. And I think, is it Greg or Hannah? You're all going to field some questions.
Yes, thank you so much for that talk. Really appreciate everything you're saying there. I'd love to start with the very first question. Is really just a clarifying question from Aaron Benjamin. And he just asks, is there a difference between multi-solving and co-benefits?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that question. Co-benefits is probably a more common term. I bet many of you have heard that, and probably not so many of you have heard multi-solving. And when we started to use the word multi-solving, we actually thought about it really carefully, because we felt like, boy, the world in this field is full of jargon. Like, we don't need one more word, do we? But we actually felt like we did. And here's the reason, at least for me, at the time that I started to think about multi-solving, most of my colleagues were climate policy experts, energy experts, and we all were like, climate, that's kind of the main benefit. And wow, your kid not having asthma so bad, that's a nice co-benefit. That, I don't know how you all hear those words, but that's what we were running into. And when we started to talk with people who were coming to multi-solving from other angles, you know, if you're at the emergency room with your kid with asthma, you might be like, that's the main benefit. And there's a nice co-benefit for the climate. So the term co-benefit, probably not intentionally, but it sets up this kind of hierarchy of importance that's really antithetical to multi-solving. The spirit of multi-solving, we think at its highest, is that your problem matters as much to me as my problem does. And so we can use this word multi-solving to kind of skirt that whole issue of what's main and what's co, and just be really thankful that we can be in solidarity together and move forward together.
Awesome, thank you. I'm going to combine a couple of questions here, one from Sonia and one from Alex. They're pretty similar, it seems. And Sonia said, what are some ways to overcome the challenges of taking up multi-solving approaches given the siloed structure of the world? And Alex added to that, what's the best way to break down barriers of experts in siloed industries to get them to collaborate? And so sadly, financial incentives have been most helpful in climate improvements.
Yeah, well, those are the big questions, right? They're not 5-minute at the end of the talk questions, are like a whole other talk. But I can add a few things that I've noticed from watching successful multi-solving. One of the ingredients, I believe, is investing time in creating trusting relationships, or allowing them to grow is probably a better way to say it. Creating the conditions for trusting relationships to grow. And as you know, that takes time. And for a lot of us, that means it also takes a budget, because you're asking people to, you know, show up for meetings and listen and learn from each other. So I think, like, seeing that as actually part of the work, a lot of us, I think, both people who fund this work and people who do it, we tend to think of the work as like the actual physical stuff that happened, like, oh, there's a new policy or there's a new rain garden. And that's true, but give yourself and your partners the grace to say, this is work, when we slow down enough to understand how our problems interconnect. And we hope to help with this at the Multisolving Institute. We have a 2-year research project that's just starting, where we're trying to better document what happens in the world when people invest in growing those trusting relationships. And one of our goals of that is to give funders a better body of evidence that this is a really good investment. My anecdotal sense is it's one of the best investments there is. Like, it takes some resources, but not that much. It's like, bring people together and listen to each other. It doesn't take lots of technology or fancy equipment, for instance. Yet I've seen whole budgets realign. I've seen flows of money, new policies no one thought was possible. So the return can be huge, but you have to believe that style of creating connections is going to lead somewhere. And to not get too geeky on systems on you all, but in systems theory, we talk about emergence, right? One of the main ways that systems change is when the connections between the parts change. And so one thing that multi-solving does is it rewires systems. And the other thing about that type of systems change is it's not controllable. You're never going to be able to write a work plan or a grant proposal that says, we're going to create new connections in this community, and then A, B, and C will happen. What you can have faith in is that there will be more collective intelligence. There'll be something to step into moments of opportunity and moments of risk. But you're going to need to trust in the wisdom of that process and realize you can't know it all in advance.
Great, thank you. Jennifer Wang asks, are there any climate solutions you have looked at that should always be multi-solved due to cost savings and multiplicative benefits, like a package deal? And then she also asked another question, which I'll just lump in here as well, which is, are there any examples of climate change solutions that don't also solve other issues, health and other human issues?
Yeah. Well, I think the great news is that most of the climate solutions I know of have the potential to be implemented in ways that solve other problems too. That's because we've created a world with fossil fuels that's not very good for us. Like, it's not good for our health because of air pollution. It's also not that good for our bodies because, moving around in automobiles, for instance, is not really what we evolved to be healthy. So a lot of what we must do for the climate can be done in ways that also provide co-benefits, particularly in health. And you have to have the multi-solving perspective, and you have to have the right people in the room to navigate in this way. So that sounds a little abstract. Here, this will make it more concrete, I hope. There was a modeling study done a few years ago about 2 different transportation options for London. One was more efficient vehicles. So that was about a lot of electric vehicles and more efficient gasoline vehicles. And the other was about more short trips taken by walking and cycling. So they did the modeling, and on greenhouse gas emissions reductions, those 2 were almost equivalent. One was like a 35% cut, one was a 38% cut, I think. But then they looked at the premature deaths prevented per million people. And the first one, the more efficient vehicles, prevented, I want to say 17 deaths per million people. So there was a little less air pollution. It helped a little bit. But what do you think more walking and cycling did? That prevented on the order of 530 deaths per million people. So on greenhouse gas emissions, if that was all you were looking at, you'd say pick one, right? Like, which is easier to get through the city council. But if you had a public health official in the room making those decisions, those 2 are not the same, right? The health benefits are so much bigger for walkable transportation. So you have to have the multi-solving lens in order for these climate solutions to deliver. And then the second part of the question was, are there any climate solutions that don't multi-solve? And my pet peeve would be carbon capture and storage, of the sort where you're capturing CO2 from power plants and storing it. Because first of all, as soon as you burn fossil fuels, you're producing air pollution, and you might be capturing CO2 and having a climate benefit, but you just squandered, right, all of those potential health benefits. And that's why environmental justice activists are usually so resistant to carbon capture and storage as a big solution, because those coal-fired power plants are in somebody's neighborhood, they're in somebody's air, then they're in somebody's lungs, right? So carbon capture and storage is a big part of a lot of current climate policy, but I don't think it's a winner when it comes to multi-solving.
Thanks. I agree with that one completely. Carl had a question here. How do we think of multi-solving when some benefits are economic, financial, and some are social? Is there a common measurement framework we can develop?
That is another important part of this 2-year research project that I mentioned. One thing I didn't have time to explain is that we think one of the ways multi-solving projects grow in scale and impact is by noticing what they're changing in the world and using that evidence to bring more partners and resources to the effort. Like, a good example of that, when I was talking about Warm Up New Zealand near the beginning, it was noticing that this jobs program was producing health benefits that then brought the health department and doctors into the program, right? If they hadn't thought to measure the health of people in those buildings, that might have been a great jobs program, and it might have ended when the financial crisis ended. So we think that one of the keys to having more multi-solving is to help people who are doing it better document their impacts. And you right away run into a bunch of problems. One of them was in that question, which is these benefits are of many different categories, like some are dollars, some are health. So that's sort of the apples and oranges problem. Other problems are about the time scale. Like, some benefits happen right away, like health and air pollution. Others might take decades, like climate change. So it's really tricky to be able to do this work and then measure it. So first you're looking across 8 or more different categories. Then you have to look across a whole bunch of different time scales. And then some of the benefits are like, you might call them ripples, right? You create a change and that change enables more change. Even for professional evaluators, it's really challenging. There's whole approaches, one called ripple evaluation, to measure that kind of thing. So those are all the problems that we wrote a grant proposal about, and it was a good enough grant proposal to get funded, but we're only like 2.5 months into it. So the nut we hope to crack is to create simple tools that make it easier for people doing this work to notice, document, and share the impacts that we're having. And we have a super team of social scientists helping with that. And you'll have to invite me back in 2 years to hear the answers.
Okay, it's an invitation. Please come back. um, we have a question about when multi-solving, how do we strike a balance, oops, it just moved on me, between solving multiple domains of an issue and avoiding mission drift?
Oh, it's funny. I keep getting this question. And I have to think about it because mission to me, and we could, it'd be nice to have a conversation over a beer of like, what does mission drift really mean? But I think mission drift only makes sense if you're working and being evaluated within a silo, which fair enough, most of us are, right? So there may be practical reasons that you have to be able to explain yourself relative to mission drift. But in systems thinking, we encourage people to grapple with the world as it is, not as our human systems have tried to make it be. So none of those silos are real. And the idea that you can have a mission within a silo in a fully interconnected world is, in my opinion, kind of a silly idea. So I don't want to minimize this or kind of like treat it lightly, because I know that we all exist within systems that are siloed. But that wouldn't be my first worry. My first worry would be, are the problems that I am responsible for addressing improving out of this project, right? So I'm part of the Riverkeeper organization, and my key metric is water quality in the river that goes through the center of the city. And we just planted a bunch of gardens, and right beside me was the Children's Asthma Coalition leader. Yeah, I'm planting gardens, but we can measure the quality of the water in the river, and it's going to get better. It is getting better. So we got there by stepping outside of our silo, but I don't think our mission drifted. Anyway, I think I'm starting to talk in circles, and that probably does require a beer, but that's my first answer.
No, that was great. Thank you. Do have a number of other questions, and we're running low on time, but I wanted to ask this one. What is the approach to identify the different benefits of one initiative? How do you identify all the different things that will solve?
Yeah, there's a couple ways to answer that. The first one, I think, is curiosity. Curiosity and kind of connection. Sometimes I joke, but I also mean it, that the easiest multi-solving tool is the cup of coffee, which just means find people outside of your silos and connect with them and understand what matters to them and what are they seeing changing. But we also, as part of the mission of the Multisolving Institute, I said we're trying to create tools that make this easier for people. And I went pretty quickly through an image you might remember that looked like a multicolored flower near the beginning, and I named some of the co-benefits. That is a tool that you can find on our website, and the acronym FLOWER stands for the Framework for Long-Term Whole System Equity-Based Reflection, which is possibly the best acronym of my life. It's a tool that can be everything from an education tool for a group of 10th graders to a planning tool for a project. What you do is you start with, okay, we're thinking about doing X. We're going to build a bike path from this city to that city. What co-benefits happen because of that decision? And then you literally can use colored pencils and print this thing out and color in the petals that you're like, okay, that's going to help health. So we'll color in that. It's going to help transportation and so on. Then you ask, are there any petals that we could also get if we just tweaked our design a little bit, or if we invited someone else into the project? So you might be able to add another petal or two. And then there's a step where for each petal you say, how do we think these benefits are going to be shared? How about the burdens? How will they be shared? And then, of course, the most important question, is there anything we can change in our design that could make that sharing of burdens and benefits be more equitable? So it's not a very sophisticated tool, but it's a good kind of like framework to clarify your thinking. And multisolving.org is our website, and you'll find that tool pretty near the top of that.
Yeah, thanks so much for that. Got two more that I hope we can get to, but the first one is asked, are there opportunities to volunteer or work with the Multisolving Institute?
I would say the best thing to do is sign up for our newsletter, and I'm pretty sure Hannah has the link. Yay, she's on it. If there are opportunities, and we do see some hiring in the next year, that will be a place for sure where we'll be announcing that. We don't have any current volunteer opportunities, but stay tuned. I think there's a chance we might.
Fantastic, thank you. And then one final one here, and you've touched on this a bit, but the question is, in my line of work, I often have to convince multiple stakeholders who have different incentives. What strategies have worked for you for achieving buy-in?
Yeah. It's funny, so many stories are flashing through my head, but they're all complicated. This might sound counterintuitive. I would encourage you to think about frustration. We did a set of interviews once with people working in this space, and one of their number one frustrations was they couldn't actually solve problems that mattered to them on their own. And I'm thinking of a particular guy who his focus was on raising large sums of money to build parks. And he started to understand that everywhere they built a park, they were creating an affordable housing crisis and displacement, because they were basically contributing to gentrification, which was totally antithetical to his personal set of values. And so that's the frustration I mean, where people aren't able to fulfill their personal values because of the silo they're stuck within. And in one of these projects, what grew up was an invitation to affordable housing experts to come in and be part of this network. And they started to understand that before any new park got announced, it was really important to have your affordable housing plan in place to secure properties, for instance, so they couldn't be bid up in a round of speculative investment. And this guy didn't have to become an expert on affordable housing. He just kept doing his really solid work fundraising for conservation. But now he had a partner that was enabling him to better live up to his personal set of values. So you don't always know where people are frustrated, but you know, this world is pretty different from where I think most people would like it to see, like to see it. And if you can find your way into that frustration and show how being part of something bigger is an answer to that, I think you have a potential to make progress.
Beth, thank you so very much for your incredible talk, your answers. For everyone here, thank you for your great questions. There are a few I didn't get to, and I apologize, but we are up against the hour, and I want to respect everyone's time. So I think we're going to wrap up here. If you're from outside the Terra community, thank you for joining us, and you can check out more at terra.to. If you are one of our current fellows, we can discuss this further in our lab groups this coming week and in the following weeks. So again, thank you so much, Beth. Thank you everyone for being here, and thanks again. Take care, everyone.
All right. Thanks, everyone. I enjoyed your questions a lot. Bye.
Bye.